Good afternoon. My name is RC Marlen. People call me RC. You can call me RC too if you like. I'll be talking about my book. It's a historical novel called Grist. It takes place before the wagon trains. The subtitle says Grist, a story of life in Oregon country, 1835 to 1854. I'd like to give you some background of how I started to write this story. I've lived in Oregon for almost 14 years. And 10 years ago, or after I'd been here 10 years, I decided, I think I'd like to write about Oregon. So I started doing some research. One of the best places, I think, in Salem to do research is the Marion County Historical Society. Maybe you don't know where that is. It's located where Mission Mill is. Well, it's not called Mission Mill anymore. They call it the Willamette Heritage Center at the Mill. It's a mouthful, so I'm just going to call that the Mill. So I went over one day to the Marion County Historical Society, and you have to pass through the mill, past the gift shop and the cafe and the bookstore, go outside again, and it's out around behind the Woolen Mill Museum. But while I was passing through the mill, all these people were dressed up in historical costume. And I spoke with this young girl. She was a high school student in a long skirt and a bonnet. I said, who are you dressed up like? And she says, my name is Margaret Jewett Bailey. I said, well, I'm doing research on Oregon. I said, I don't know her. She says, she used to live in this area. And her book that she wrote is in our bookstore if you'd like to go see. So I didn't go in the bookstore. I went out to the Marion County Historical Society and looked up Margaret Jewett Bailey. They didn't have too much on her, but they had some journals and some recordings. And I'd like to read a paragraph from one of the journals. This is the Marion County History, June 1959. Now, her book was written in 1854, but this was written in 1959. Margaret J. Bailey, Oregon Pioneer and Author, by O.W. Frost. Margaret Jewett Bailey, for 20 years, was a resident within what is now Marion County. She was a truly amazing woman. She was the first white woman to settle on a French prairie farm, the first local poet to be published in a newspaper, the Oregon Spectator, and the author of the first autobiography published in the Northwest. She was 25 years old and as yet unmarried when she sailed to Oregon. She came on a ship in 1837 with David Leslie and his family. They were all going to be missionaries at the Methodist Mission. She soon proved to be a highly successful as a teacher of Indian girls, and she showed considerable promise as a writer of poetry and prose. She was sending her articles back to newspapers in the East, and that's why he must have said that. But her Oregon years were unhappy years. She quarreled openly and repeatedly with most of her fellow workers at the mission, and she was twice married and twice divorced. She was earnest, devout, captious, and hypersensitive. So, why, might you ask, did O.W. Frost write this article in 1959 about Margaret Jewett Bailey? Well, it seems that all her books that she wrote in 1854 were destroyed. I picture they made a huge bonfire because they didn't have shredders back then, and they started throwing her books in and burned them all. I don't know that as a fact. But he was writing about, because in the 1940s through the 50s, they were trying to figure out who this Margaret Jewett Bailey was. They couldn't find any copy of her book, but they found reviews. By they, I mean professors in the universities in Oregon. But sometime between that time in the 40s or 50s, a volume surfaced. It was part 2, because her book was written in 2 parts. Part 2 surfaced, and they sent out the word, does anyone know about this woman? And the second part, Volume 1, was found on the other side of the country in Yale University. So now they had both parts of her book except the burned parts of one chapter. And they found that missing chapter in newspaper articles because they did have the title of that chapter. So they reconstructed her book. Her book was called The Grains. It's an autobiography, even though she claims it was fiction. She changed all the names of the people, but not too far. She used the first letter of every person she was talking about in the book. That day at the mill, I thought, wow, I'm going to write about this because no one seems to know about her. And I wanted to write about things that people did not know. Do you remember that I while reading the article about O.W. Frost, he said that she was earnest and devout, captious and hypersensitive. Well, I read her book 5 times. The first time I decided, I can't write about this woman. She's horrible. One of the things that made her that way was she's captious. She's exaggerates defaults or trivial things about people. And in her book, she wrote pages and pages and pages complaining about people. And she didn't just present it once, she'd present it chapters later. She couldn't let it drop. And it was so annoying. I thought, I don't want to write about this woman. But with the second and third reading, I became a little more relaxed, and I started reading between the lines, and I learned more about her. And I started seeing on the 4th or 5th reading that she was a lot like me, or I was a lot like her. She was an environmentalist and a feminist. She was a woman before her time. She felt women were equal to men, and in her book, she would show you that she'd put herself in situations with men and not even think anything of it and make enemies of those men.
Excuse us.
No, I'm glad you're here. I'm glad you're here. So I had finally decided to write the book about her, but not just about her. When I wrote my book, I had been doing research while I was reading her book 5 times and had found more than 30 other people that I would like to consider in my book. And I've listed those characters, they're actual historical people that lived in my book so people can refer back to them and keep track of who the historical people are. People like, you probably know them, Jason Lee and, well, Joseph Jervis, as everybody mispronounces his French name. And Ewing Young is another person. And of course, the head of the Hudson's Bay Company, the chief factor, John McLaughlin, is in here. As well as George Kirby Gay, the man who built the first brick house here in Oregon, and he made his own bricks.
How about Hillary?
No, I don't have Hillary. You're welcome to come up to my table and peruse the book and look over those 30 characters if you would like. So her husband was a doctor, a surgeon, who practiced in Oregon. And there was, it was a difficult marriage, as I mentioned before. They were divorced at one point. Also, in my list of characters is a girl from the Kalapuyan tribe, a real person who lived that was in Margaret's book that I decided to write about. And I thought it would be nice if I would share some of the aspects of my book, and you could hear how I write by reading a section about this girl. In Margaret's book, The Grains, she called her Sally Sewell. She was a girl that had come to the mission. They had a lot of children, maybe 12 or 15 children at the mission. And when the children came to the mission, they had to give up their Native American name, and the missionaries called them Christian names. This girl was called Sally Sewell. So since the missionaries felt they had a right that they could rename someone, I too thought I can rename this little girl, and I researched the Kalapuyan language and came up with the name Sawala. It means sunflower seed. Margaret explained what she looked like. She was a very tiny person, and she was as small as a sunflower seed to me. So I'm reading in my book grist. Of course, grist comes from what is made in the grist mills, and the grains go into the grist mill, and that's why my book is called Grist, since it's second. Chapter 4, Sawala, the Métis. The Métis means that she was a mix between the white people as well as her Native American tribe. Life among the Kalapuyan Indians from 1836 to 1837. Like everyone else, Sawala had always called her mother Waka, not knowing that that meant slave in the Kalapuyan language. Sawala never knew her mother's real name because soon after Sawala had been born, they both were traded to the Kalapuyan tribe, who forbid them from speaking anything but the language of the Kalapuyans. During all of Sawala's life, her mother had repeated upon waking, "This day I greet you and remind you that I am a slave because you came from my body with the hair the color of the sun. My people did not like this and traded me and you to the Kalapuyans. Now we are forever slaves." Both Sawala and Waka had the flattened brow of their people, the Chinook tribe. Waka carried her head high. She was proud of her flattened forehead. For her daughter, who could remember no other life except her time among the Kalapuyan children who taunted her for her blonde hair and blue eyes and flattened forehead, her brow was a burden. Sawala was a gentle soul and always wanted to please. She worked hard and with pleasure. She liked her life. She enjoyed gathering the blackberries, elderberries, huckleberries, and salmon berries when those seasons came. She picked hazelnuts and acorns in the late summer and fall. She liked the travels to different places to search for the berries and nuts, as well as the trips to catch salmon. But her favorite time was the harvest of the camas. It grew in the rain shadow climate on the savannah. The morning dawned with a drizzle. Sawala rose and braided her hair. Even in a braid, it went past her waist. She remembered being in the camas fields weeks ago when they had removed all the poison camas and when she had slept with a man called Bailey. She donned her deerskin with a black tail draping over her shoulder. She secured the skin around her body with a strip of rawhide and slipped out from under the tree where she had slept. Away from the others who still slept, she lifted her face to the falling rain, enjoying the coolness, and then she circled around the camp to greet the birds. She returned after a few minutes. Upon seeing her daughter, Waka turned to say the usual, "This day of the falling rain, I greet you to remind you that I am a slave, because you came from my body," and she finished her recitation and tied her fur to her waist. And Sawala returned the greeting as always, "Forgive my birth, Waka. I try this day to make it up to you." Sawala and Waka walked with a group of 6 other women in their cone-shaped hats made from the woven grasses to a field where the camas had dropped their violet blue petals. None of the noble women would come to this harvest. Only the commoners and the slaves worked on the plants. One of the commoners, was designated a leader. She was called Tupka. "The plant waits to give us food. Dig with the speed of a diving eagle," Waka told her daughter. "The slaves with the fewer bulbs are going to be struck by the leader." "I know," said Sawala. What they both accumulated went into Waka's quota because Sawala was still considered a child. On her knees, Sawala reached into their basket to get her digging tool made of deer antlers. Some were made from wood, and they broke easily. Hers had been given to her by the noble family and was a prized tool made from antlers. Oh, I lost my place. Because she always dug many bulbs. It came in 2 pieces, a long curved digging stick with a hole at one end for the handle that made a T-shaped implement. Clutching the antler's handle, she thrust the long curved point down into the soil along the stem of the plant and twisted it to loosen the small egg-shaped white bulbs. With a flip of her wrist, the bulbs were thrust up out of the soil. Bulbs were chosen for size. The smaller ones were returned to the hole to grow for another season. Waka and Sawala dropped their harvest bulbs into the burden basket that they had woven from green branches. I have a picture of a burden basket. I don't know if you can see it from there, but stop by my table and you can see it on page. Oh, there's no pages on the photograph pages. On 100, page 100. They worked all morning gathering bulbs. While they worked, Sawala talked. Listen to the life in the sky, the one who has the breast the color of blood. She stopped her digging a moment and removed her hat. While shading the sunlight from her eyes with her hand, she saw the bird. Look, he sits at the top of the tree close to us. He sings like my heart feels. Not wanting to take too much time away from her work and looking at a robin, she donned her hat again and returned her gaze downward and shoved the point into the soil again. And she stopped her words, and she began to work quietly because she was watching her mother move away from her. Waka began to work her way between other women, farther and farther from her daughter. Sawala glanced at her mother and saw the familiar look of torment in her mother's face. At these times, the girl surmised that her mother dwelled on memories of her life before becoming a slave. Sawala accepted her mother's need for quiet and watched as Waka moved further away, putting the bulbs in a small skin packet that Sawala had made for her mother. After a while, Waka moved back to Sawala's side, and the girl continued her cheerful chatter. Waka, did you see the black noisy ones soar from the cedar tree? I think there were more than my fingers and toes. Look at the size of this camas root. I've never seen one this large. It's like the egg from the ones who float on the water. And Sawala held up the bulb that looked like a duck egg for her mother to see. Their basket filled quickly. Let's go together and dump our basket. It's heavy. You take one side, Waka said, and they proceeded to an area where older women were beating bulbs in the shade. They were going to boil them and render them soft to make the cakes that would take them through the winter. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
And
RC, do you use, in your books, do you use real places and names?
oh, yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So in the book where she lived or whatever would be, and the places that she
Everything is
frequented, so
authentic
it's
in the
authentic.
book. Yes, it's a historical fiction, but I've made up one character,
Okay.
and I've listed him in my list of characters, and it says fictitious character. His name's Arnaud Boguet, and I had gathered so many stories that were so interesting. I had to pull them all together into something that would make the reader want to get through the book. And so when Arnaud was in the scene, or his family, then it's a made-up scene.
Are you doing another book?
Yes, I am. I'm working on a book about Oregon. Actually, it'll start during this time. There were so many figures that I wanted to put in, but it wasn't logical, that I will be doing it again in my next book. It's called Yesterday's Rain.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming.
Where